By now, you've seen think pieces on how Christopher Nolan's new film adaptation of the Odyssey is woke. Helen of Troy is black. Not a single Greek actor was cast. And most egregiously, he dared use Emily Wilson's new translation, which bills itself as feminist. A feminist retelling of a bro on his ship with all his homies for 10 years just doing bro things, like tying yourself to the mast so you can holler at some baddies, or poking a big disabled guy with a stick, or cheating on your wife with a nymph. What happens on Ogygia stays on Ogygia. Am I right, fellas? The complaint was that Wilson's Odyssey is ideologically woke, that she retranslated the poem to serve a contemporary political agenda. She even calls handmaidens slaves. More on that in a minute. But the argument that I'm going to make here is that the controversy mistakes a structural feature of translation for a political act. Every translation is, in fact, an interpretation. The only question is whether the interpreter knows what they're doing or not. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm Dr. Taylor Jones. I've got a PhD in linguistics from the University of Pennsylvania, and here on the channel I discuss everything relating to language, linguistics, language learning, and culture. If you're into those topics, be sure to subscribe and ring the bell for notifications. This is Language Jones. Let's start at the most reasonable place, the beginning.
Let's start at the very beginning.
The opening words are a perfect case study. The poem's second word in Greek is Polytropon, modifying man. It can be rendered literally as many turning or much turned. The passive-active ambiguity is itself significant. Is Odysseus doing the turning or being turned by fate? And unsurprisingly, different translators translate it differently. Butler as that ingenious hero who traveled far and wide. Pope, what was it, just translated by various jobs? Anyway, Pope translates it as the man for wisdom's various arts renowned, leaning into the many turns as tricksiness idea. Lattimore translates as man of many ways, which is ambiguous. Fagles chooses man of twists and turns, and Emily Wilson chooses a complicated man. Lattimore's is non-committal, and Wilson's is morally and psychologically layered. The emphasis is on his interiority, not the ingenious traveler. All of these are defensible renderings of the same word. None is wrong. Each primes a completely different character before the story even begins. Fagles' Odysseus is slippery, evasive, serpentine. The emphasis is on his cunning. Even more so for Alexander Pope's translation. People seem to forget that it's a translation of Greek, and as such, there isn't one correct translation in English. More on why in just a second. But we make a mistake when we assume it's ideology. Yes, Wilson's translation is influenced by her identity as a woman and her worldview, but as she points out in her introduction, the same could be said of Alexander Pope or of Robert Fagles. Men are not the default against which all else is measured. Huge if true. And making choices like complicated or of twists and turns is the inescapable task of translation. Polytropon cannot be carried whole into English. But that raises the question, why can't it? I've alternately argued that there are no untranslatable words and that translation is basically impossible. And there's actually no contradiction between those two. Here's why. A word in any language sits inside a web of associations, collocations, and primes. Words it habitually appears with, contexts it evokes. As J.R. Firth put it in 1957, you shall know a word by the company it keeps. I first learned this in Dan Jurafsky's magnum opus on speech and language processing. The word polytropon will connect to a lot of other words that it evokes, even just through sound, but also through shared meanings and through common co-occurrences. Any choice in English will have its own web of meanings and things that it evokes, and those networks will be completely different. So taking Wilson's complicated, in English in 2017, it carries therapy speak resonance, complicated relationships, situationships, feelings. That's not in the Greek. And Wilson can't quarantine her English word from those associations. Odysseus was not reclining on a therapist's couch, recounting how his father made him feel, lamenting that everybody's always asking, where's Odysseus? But nobody's asking, how's Odysseus? I see that you introduce yourself as Odysseus, son of Laertes, known to all men for his cunning. Do you feel that you have something to prove to your father about your intellect? Twists and turns, on the other hand, is evocative of action, thriller, and also maybe being buffeted about by the fates, or even of being capricious. Man of many ways sounds perhaps evocative of the King James translation of the Bible. Perhaps attempting to lend the translation a sort of gravitas through imitation of the most significant English version of the most important book in the language. The point is, though, that you can't choose a word in the target language without dragging in its whole network of semantic associations. It's just a property of language, and it's true of every word and how you translate the grammatical structure of sentences, too. So every choice compounds until you have radically different translations with radically different feelings and outlooks. By the way, if you want to know more about how words work in the brain, definitely check out my upcoming self-paced digital intro to linguistics, The Language Blueprint. I'm still writing and filming, but it will cover all major subfields and it's going to be a blast. You can sign up for the waitlist or for more information at www.languagejones.com/blueprint. So anyway, when I said you have to decide how to translate the grammatical structure of sentences, it's even worse than it sounds. Because punctuation is actually a new technology in the grand scheme of things. The Greek original has no punctuation. Ancient manuscripts had no word breaks either. Every comma, period, dash, and question mark in any translation is an interpretive act. Punctuation shapes emphasis, pacing, and what belongs to what. A comma can determine whether a clause modifies the noun before it or the verb after it. Putting this all together, it's worth looking at how Fagles and Wilson translate the first few lines. With punctuation. This is the most invisible form of interpretation, which is why it's the most powerful. Readers assume punctuation is neutral. So let's compare side by side. Here's Wilson. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered in the storms at sea, and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed to keep them safe, poor fools. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. Find the beginning. And here's Fagles. Sing to me of the man, Muse, the man of twists and turns, driven time and again off course. Once he had plundered the hallowed heights of Troy. Many cities of men he saw and learned their minds. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea, fighting to save his life and bring his comrades home. But he could not save them from disaster, hard as he strove. The recklessness of their own ways destroyed them all, the blind fools. They devoured the cattle of the sun, and the sun god blotted out the day of their return. Launch out on his story, Muse, daughter of Zeus. Start from where you will. Sing for our time too. So let's take a second here. What's the difference in effect between he wandered and was lost and driven time and again off course? Among other things, it's agency, whether his wanderings are his doing or that of, say, an angry Poseidon or sun god. And this recurs throughout their translations. He failed to keep them safe versus he could not save them from disaster. Has the same difference in agency, and Fagles' adds a certain element of futility. It's not immediately clear whether he even tried, whereas attempting is a presupposition of failing. More than that, though, Wilson clearly sticks to straightforward, plain speech, and she can't help but allude to why. Tell the old story for our modern times. Fagles, on the other hand, translates the same as start from where you will, sing for our time too. The translator's choice of how to render the narrator's voice in addressing the muse, how's that for a complicated frame, does a lot here. Wilson is demanding modernity, and she makes choices that adhere to that. He suffered in the storms at sea. They ate the sun god's cattle. Her version is consistently active and plain-spoken. Fagles' Odysseus was heartsick on the open sea and his men devoured rather than ate. He's using a higher register of language, evocative in some ways of course, the King James, the benchmark for literary English still. And he's attempting to work in metrical choices. Many pains he suffered, heartsick on the open sea. Wilson is doing the same, but with different meter, and they're both technically doing it in free verse, unlike, say, Alexander Pope doing it in iambic pentameter. None of these are radical departures, except maybe iambic pentameter. They're synonym choices, register choices, but on the aggregate, they accumulate into a totally different book. And beyond all of that, you get into actually controversial topics. Wilson renders the word dmoai, forgive my pronunciation, as slaves. The word has always referred to enslaved household women. Previous translators rendered this as handmaidens, serving women, maids, whereas Wilson translates it simply as slaves, which is what the Greek actually plainly states. The criticism is that she imported a modern political frame, but the more accurate description is that every prior translator who wrote handmaidens made a euphemistic choice, whether consciously or not, that softened the social reality that the Greek describes plainly. And the criticism of Wilson is that she was celebrated for being the first female translator of the Odyssey, and she brought a feminist approach to it. I think she rightly pushes back on this and states that one could just as easily claim that all the men up to this point brought a masculinist approach.
Right. So nobody, I mean, I'm sure nobody has asked Robert Fagles ever if his male bias influences his interpretation of the Odyssey.
The late lamented Fagles, he's yes, it's too late to ask him now, but yeah. It's in a way it's sad, but it's revealing that it's just sort of assumed that of course he's a man because that's the normal way to be, you know.
Right.
The abnormal humans are the women.
If we want to say that she's blinded by her womanhood, then we can't help but concede that perhaps Fagles and Lattimore and Pope and all the others wrote translations that were shaped by their manhood. I kept that word in for the parallelism, but don't think too hard about writing with your manhood. It's evocative of names written in yellow snow. Anyway, the choice is not between a neutral translation and a political one. It's between two political choices, one of which was invisible because it was conventional. And much as we like to think otherwise, men are not the default human from which women sadly diverge. So which translation is correct? All of them, unless the translator did some egregiously bad translating. There's no true Odyssey in English because the poem exists in Greek. What we have is a family of readings, each legitimate and each partial. But which one is best then? Honestly, what I recommend is reading more than one. And for this video, I read a lot more than I shared on screen in parallel, and it was a tremendously rich experience. I literally read 2 or 3 concurrently. And I do mean concurrently. It's a much, much richer experience. And I think seeing how 2 or more translators choose to render the Greek in wildly different ways helps get at what the Greek source material they're working from was actually doing, with all of its different multifaceted shades of nuance. From Yidden here will not be surprised at this being my recommendation, since the practice of twice in the original, once in translation, and that translation isn't English, plus commentaries, is just a regular weekday practice for learning Torah. But applying it to something like the Odyssey, I should do Beowulf next, is not something I'd tried before, and I can't believe that I didn't. The Odyssey has been translated into English over 100 times. You'd be forgiven for assuming, incorrectly, that that's a sign that no one has gotten it right yet. Instead, it's a sign that the poem contains more than any single English text can hold. There's a reason that we're still translating, reading, and discussing this poetry. And every translation is a wager on which properties of the original matter most to the reader. Wilson wagered on moral clarity and psychological interiority, and that's a defensible wager. It's also the one that Nolan bet $250 million on. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you can support it on YouTube with super thanks, or over on Patreon at patreon.com/languagejones. Please leave me a comment. They are great for the algorithm, and subscribe if you haven't already. Until next time, happy reading.